to turn this over to Holden Richards, who's a great new team member for Click, and I don't know if I could have survived this without all the help Holden has provided. But I'm gonna turn the reins over to Holden, and he's gonna introduce Mark to you guys. So welcome. We're glad you're here. Holden, take it away, my friend.
Indeed, it is a pleasure to have Mark here. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
I wanted to say that I'm super happy to have Mark here, and I'm just going to say a few brief words of introduction. Mark Osterman began his study of historical photographic processes while at the Kansas City Art Institute in the 70s, where he says he became an expert in the field through reading and practice. And Mark would later build on that experience and go on to teach fine art photography at the George School in Newtown, Pennsylvania for the next 20 years. In the early 1990s, Mark put his reading and practice to good use, teaching himself how to make collodion plates by the study of old books and manuals. At that time, according to Mark, there were probably only 7 or 8 people who knew in the world who knew how to do the process. It was at this time that he also created a traveling medicine show, Dr. Bumstead's celebrated Lenap liquid show. He played a banjo of his own construction, sold a palliative elixir, kazoos, and nose flutes from the folding stage installed in the back of a 1919 Model T Ford. In 1991, Mark and France Scully established Scully and Osterman and began giving photographic demonstrations and workshops throughout the United States. In 1997, Mark and France were both named guest scholars at the George Eastman House, where they received scholarships to attend its certificate program in museum studies. After completing the program, France remained a guest scholar, and Mark was subsequently invited to join the George Eastman House as a process historian. And so he retired the traveling medicine show. In the late 1990s, Mark and France would go on to introduce Sally Mann to a wet plate collodion process as she began to experiment with her own processes. Mark has since followed in the footsteps of the great photographic pioneers. In 2002, Niepce House, in collaboration with the George Eastman House, invited Mark to Paris to help recreate daguerreotype views from the same window that Daguerre himself had used to demonstrate his process, the results later being displayed in the home of Niepce. And in 2014, Mark and France completed The Light of Lecoq, the sun sketches at the twilight of photography that involved retracing the steps of noted 19th century British photographer Henry Fox Talbot to a 12th century Lecoq Abbey in England. Mark has written on the subject of early photographic processes, and publications include an extensive entry into the Focal Encyclopedia of Photography. As an artist, his work is widely exhibited and published in numerous publications and collected in private and museum collections. It is our pleasure with Click tonight to welcome Mark Osterman.
Am I on? I think I am. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to do my best to try to demystify how I approach making images using historic photographic processes. And along the way, I'm going to give you some biographical information because I think it's really important for budding artists to understand where artists get their inspiration. So I have to talk about myself, my favorite subject. I don't do pictures of things that are important to all men. I do pictures that are important to me. And so I think I should really just get to the PowerPoint. Let me start the PowerPoint here, if I can do that. All right, I'm not sure if I'm on yet.
Not yet.
Okay. I think I pushed the wrong button. France is getting back to where we should be. France does all the high-tech work. I do all the low-tech work.
You are good to go.
All right. All right, you should see a screen that says the word anatomy.
Yep.
Okay, great. The emphasis of this particular talk is about my last body of work, which is called Anatomy. And I thought maybe you'd enjoy seeing how I came to make that body of work. So I'm going to start out with biographical information. When I was a young man, I was very interested in things that were mechanical. I was surrounded by mechanical things. I grew up on what was an old farmstead, 18th century farmstead in eastern Pennsylvania. There were always old machines. I had three brothers, and they all worked on old machines. In this particular case, here's a photograph of my great grandfather, Kelly. He's on the right-hand side. Kelly was a little bit of a medicine man. He came up with a lot of great ideas. In this particular case, he invented a prefab garage in the early days of automobiles. And so these are inspirations to me. I never met the man, but when you see the pictures of someone like this in their 1910 Marmon in the garage that he built, they're influences. Here's a picture of me when I was 16. By the time I was 16, I had taught myself how to play banjo. And growing up in eastern Pennsylvania, there were only so many jobs a young man could do. And so I started out baling hay, and that was a very hard job. And so I realized soon off that it would be better for me to make money if I were to play the banjo and have people pay me. So I started playing the banjo, and at the same time, I was finding these old phonographs at flea markets. So I would play the banjo for various parties in restaurants. In particular, I was playing on an old steam train. And so I would take tickets, I would do the brake test, unhook the cars, and then come back into the train and play all these old songs that nobody my age knew, but lots of old people knew. And that was good for a $1 to $5 tip. So that's me playing banjo on the steam train and then spending the money to buy more broken old phonographs that I could fix and make play and learn the music. I even got to the point where I wanted to bring home this. There was an opportunity for me to get a steam train for free if I could just get it to the field on the front of our house. And I came very close. Luckily, it didn't happen. My poor mother would have had a heart attack. But I did bring other things home. And in particular, one of them was this Model T truck, or what was left of the Model T truck. I never did get this Model T running. Now I could probably get it running in about 5 or 6 days. But back then I didn't have the knowledge to get it running, but I did have the knowledge of how to take it apart. So that's the first step, is taking things apart, of course, and then figuring out how to put them back together and run. But this particular car, and if you notice, this is in part of our carriage house. If you look on the wall, there's where we've tested spray paint. The floor was a dirt floor. At the age of 16 or 17, I did this painting of that car in that garage, looking the other direction. And so I was interested in how to depict these mechanical things. I mean, I was interested in painting other things. Here's an outhouse, an octagonal outhouse I painted that was part of my portfolio to get into the Kansas City Art Institute when I went to school there. I later realized that I really didn't want to be a painter. I really wanted to make musical instruments. And so here's a drawing on the left-hand side of some of the inlay work. I was a specialist in inlaying mother of pearl and then engraving the pearl, much like you do when you engrave jewelry. And this is one of the banjos I made. Actually, it's the last banjo I made. But for several years, when I was out of college, I had a business called Musical Antiquities. Musical Antiquities had a storefront for the first year, and then the later years I did it out of my home. But this was in Lambertville, New Jersey, and at the time I was showing people how to play instruments. I was selling antiques. I was restoring musical instruments, and I was making them from scratch. I was influenced by a lot of interesting men. One in particular, and It's just coincidental. I have a painting. These are actually from slides of a portfolio. I don't know where the paintings are today, but here is a Model T Ford. And if you notice the car and the tree, here is a photograph of the man who owned that Ford, the same tree. I bought a Model T from this man, or what was left of it. And he was a very interesting, very strange man, but I learned a lot about how mechanical things work, how to take something apart and put it back together again. So here is the remnants of a Model T I bought from this man. And there's my father, my late father, as we dragged it home to the farm. I brought the car up into the woodworking shop of the George School where I was teaching at the time. And in about 2 months, it rolled out as this. So I built a wooden body and I did the upholstery, made the engine work. And it was fun, but I wanted to combine it with something. And so what I combined it with is me. I invented myself as a traveling medicine man. This actually started around 1977. I called myself Dr. Bumstead. And in this particular photograph, I'm trying my best to look about my age now, but actually in the picture, I'm in my late 20s. I'm with a tripod and a box called a tripes and keister with the instruments, and I would go and sell snake oil. I found that the walk around show could only take me so far. So what I did was build a contraption to fit on the back of my Model T. And that box would open up as a stage. The stage had bunting that would open up. It had backdrops. And I performed off the stage, eventually with an assistant. This is David Kirkpatrick, who played the genuine faux Indian, never meant to be an Indian, just a bad excuse for someone trying to be like that. And I did that show for 20 years. It was a very important part of my life. At the same time, I was doing photography. In fact, in college, I made a daguerreotype. But really, the medicine show was the most important thing in my life at that time. After teaching for 20 years, France and I moved up to Rochester, New York from the Philadelphia area. And about a year after I arrived, I got in my Model T and I was cut off in traffic and I flipped it. And I ended up underneath. The car was leaking gasoline on me. Something happened here, France. It looks like it stopped. It says, make sure Keynote is open on France's MacBook Pro. Your devices are on the same. All right, thank you. Thank you, technical assistant. And so I put that car back together again. I rebuilt the car. I found an old sofa on the side of the road, and I field stripped it for the leather and rebuilt some antique seats to produce this. I converted it into a speedster, and I drove it that way much faster than I should. Here's a picture taken with the Graflex to show the kind of Lartigue distorted wheels that you're used to seeing in the old photographs. And eventually, I sold it. People thought I was crazy to sell the thing. It was a great car to drive. But the reason I sold it was because I found something else. I found this. This is the basis of the new work called Anatomy. It's a 1923 Model T Ford runabout. If you look on the lower right-hand corner, you can see the runabout. Those are all the different body styles. It came home on a trailer in 2016, in November of 2016, and I started to work on it immediately. I started taking things apart, taking it completely apart. France took this picture of my legs outside the garage. When I took the engine apart, mice had a party in the cylinder head. The water jackets were completely full of bits and pieces. And it had an interesting history. Here is a freeze plug on the engine that someone had used a buffalo nickel to repair. And so the car came to me about the same time I was thinking heavily about my late father. My father died only a couple of years earlier. And I was thinking of the metaphor of people trying to keep old automobiles going. Now, mind you, this is a car from 1923. It's in its 90s. My father died in his 90s. And there's something very similar to trying to keep a car running. You're exchanging parts. With an old man, you're also exchanging parts. You have grafts, there are skin diseases, there are things with the heart. And so I was trying to figure out a way to channel this to my artwork. And so I didn't really want to do pictures of my father when he was ill. This is really homage to my father. And so I started taking things out. There's the engine. By December, it looked like this. Certain details, it was clear that it needed work. In this particular case, mice had made a nest on top of the gas tank, and because of that, it rusted through on this part of the body. There were bits and pieces that I had to store because I didn't plan to work on them until spring. And so I put the body, right? The body. I put the body up in the rafters of my single-story garage. I hit my head on that almost every day when I worked in there in the winter. This is the garage, mind you, that was built in 1919 and has no heat. But I started taking pictures for my own reference. These are the fenders that were on my porch. They stayed there for the entire winter because I had no other place to put them. And as I started looking at the shapes, I really fell in love with them. On the left is a door lock. On the right, the horn button. But in particular, I love the carburetors. The carburetors look like human hearts. I can see ventricles. It's the size of something that fits in your hand. You feel like you've pulled the heart out of the body and you have this thing in your hand when you hold a carburetor from the 1920s or the teens. Here's the engine on a rack, a wood rack that I built just to get it out of the way. Taking things apart with wrenches, whacking things with hammers. I'm thinking of the surgeons working on things. I'm thinking of bone surgeons. I took these pictures originally so that I could put the damn thing back together again. But the more I took the pictures, the more I liked just looking at the objects. These are the clutch discs. I guess I could have done a book just in color of these things. This is charging the magnets on the magneto. There are 16 magnets on the flywheel. And I had to recharge them. Pulling things off, using heat to melt things so that I could pull things off. On the left, that's part of the drive shaft housing. It has kind of a god look to it, a primitive god look to it. And on the right-hand side, those are leaves for the rear spring, very much like rib cage. The differential in the rear of the car after cleaning. And I looked for things to replace parts that, were no good. A lot of these things, I like dead people's things for sale. A lot of these things you might find at a flea market. Other times they were auto shows. On the right-hand side, there's a stash of wheel bearings and bits, all potential subjects for the anatomy series, but I didn't know it yet. I was saving one fender that I found at a yard sale just for one bracket. There it is on the fender on the right-hand side. That one is on the top, and the one that's broken is on the bottom. You find these things where you can. And eventually I worked from the frame up. There is the frame with nothing on it. And there is the chassis, a running chassis. I actually put a box on the gas tank and rode it around like that for a few days. And so I got this thing and it was November 2016. By the next May, I took it to the inspection station. And so it went from this to this. And actually looks much different today. Now it has a top and I've redone the seats. But now I'm going to talk about the photography part. That was the inspiration. And now here's the photography. I was interested in glass plate photography even when I was a young boy. When I was 15 years old, I worked in a machine shop. And the man who owned the machine shop had many trunks of family things above the shop and let me go through them when I had my lunch break. And in one box, there were many cased images, daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and tintypes. And he gave me this one. It's a Civil War soldier. It's actually a Union soldier with a gray uniform. It's early in the war. And it's a great ambrotype. It's not just an ambrotype, it's a great ambrotype. The look on his face, when you look into the eyes, even the feeling of flesh on the hands, very different than a lot of the aesthetic that we hold today with ambrotypes, where there's not so much roundness in the skin. But in this particular case, there's a feeling of presence. I have been looking at this picture since I've been 15, and it is a heavy influence. I wanted to make these things. So at 15, I couldn't. But by the time I was in college, I started really thinking about it. And when I started teaching at George School, I asked the chemistry department if they had any collodion. And luckily, they had a gallon of the stuff from the 1940s that they were throwing out. All I needed was the instructions. I traded a Leica camera for this manual from the 1850s. I got it at one of the old time photo shows, back when they had photo shows. You could buy lenses and darkroom equipment. And a man had several old lenses and he had this manual. I couldn't afford it, but I could trade my Leica. And this opened up my world. This was around 1986-ish, I am thinking. And there really was no one that I could go to. The internet wasn't available, but I had this. And so I started to unlock the secrets for myself, pouring collodion. For those of you who don't know this process, I'm not going to go heavily into the process, but essentially collodion is a binder. It holds iodides and bromides. You pour it on a plate. When you dip it in silver nitrate, it becomes sensitive to light. And you can make pictures with it, either tintypes, ambrotypes, or negatives. I started out trying to make direct positives. This is one of my earliest pieces. And I remember the day because they were coming out. There was no fog. They were working. And anybody that's gone through learning how to do a process like collodion knows exactly what I mean when you have that day when everything's working. And so, France, can you do this again? My screen is shutting down. I'm not sure if people can hear me. France will make it work again. She's brilliant. Don't go away. Stay right there. This particular picture is a George School student. And what's interesting about it is I only had a couple of sheets of glass cut, and I would use them and I would wipe the images off over and over again. I really wanted to make a tintype, but I didn't have the material. What I did have were 4x5-inch sheet film holders. This is a plastic dark slide from a sheet film holder, which is a very expensive material to use for making collodion images. But for me, this is what I needed. This image is not varnished. It has survived to this day like this in an envelope. And about the time that France and I met, we decided that we would try to take some pictures. And the way we wanted to take pictures, we had a reference of that antique photograph. We would see if we could make pictures that looked like Civil War pictures at reenactments. And so I built the darkroom that's on the right-hand side. The darkroom had a copper sink. It had a drain. You put your arms in the sleeves to manipulate the plates. And we went to a few of the reenactments, and it really wasn't our thing. The best part about them was being around the campfire at night and playing banjo and fiddle music. Here is an image made during that period, and it was okay. But it drifted into another way of thinking about these. And so here's an image I made of the same fellow, and this time it's a parody on the Civil War reenactors. In fact, what you can see here is this fellow has a huge hat. If you look at the ears, you might think that those are the cords from the hat. But if you follow them down far enough, you'll go down to the table and you'll see that he has a Sony Walkman. So that was my homage to 19th century portrait photography. And back then, France and I would put a pin on our subjects. If you look on his lapel, there's a pin that shows an S and an O intertwined. And I cut that out of brass, and we would put that on the subjects for fear that once in a while when we make these, we would give them away. We were worried that maybe sometime someone might think that this was an antique image. Not if they see the Sony Walkman, but you never know. And indeed, we did have a few images end up in books as authentic pictures. The banjo in this picture is also something I made, the fretless banjo. Well, you know, I like the ambrotypes, I like the tintypes, but I think that we were leaning more towards being photographers. Now, I know this is a confusing thing. When you hear people talk about collodion, they'll often say they're collodion photographers. In fact, in the 19th century, if you were a photographer, what you were making was negatives, and you were using the negatives to make paper prints. If you were making tintypes, you were a tintypist or a tintyper. If you were making ambrotypes, you were an ambrotypist or an ambrotyper or a verotyper if you were in England. And so we started to look at the process not for the direct positive, which is what's the most popular variant of the process, even today. We were more interested then in making negatives. Now, around the same time, I was experimenting with calotype. This is a calotype negative of the school. And this particular calotype is using Talbot's first technique. So it's a true Talbot type calotype. And the next image is the salted paper print from that. And frankly, I'm in love with the calotype process. I wish I didn't have a job and could just make calotypes, because I love, in particular, I love the negatives more than the prints, but I do love the calotype process. But we were making negatives. And so here is an 8x10 collodion negative. And mind you, my influence in 19th century photography and the techniques used in the 19th century were how they used the processes back then, the aesthetic of making what was the best, cleanest, artifact-free plate. And the reason for that is I really liked the way it photographed. I didn't want to show the streaks and the drips and all the things we all love now. I didn't want to show them because I felt that they took the viewer to the surface of the plate. I want the viewer to go deep into the image. And so an image like this, which has such a feeling of depth, you feel like there's a roundness to the subject, I believe would be killed by having some kind of a streak on the surface or some other kind of collodion artifact that zooms you back to the plate rather than the image. At least that's what I believe then. I've softened, but this is what I was doing. And I believe this image may be from 1990. What do you think, France? 2? Somewhere around there. Here's another one. And now I have a kind of a 19th century approach, but clearly not a 19th century subject. Irv Miller, who was the wrestling coach at the school. At the time that we were working at George School, our studio was actually a large greenhouse. And of course, greenhouses, you want as much sun as possible. And for a skylight studio, you actually want a more diffused light. And so we bought 4 king-size light blue bed sheets, and I sewed them together, and we covered the entire skylight to diffuse the light. And so this was taken in that same space. Around that time, we realized that we didn't want to just do the process in the studio. We wanted to go out of the studio and do other things. And so I built a little darkroom box that was made of very thin plywood, and it had hinges made of canvas. And this wood box could be folded up into a box. It had Velcro to hold it together, and it could be knocked down into a very thin package. And the cloth that covers it could be wrapped around it, could be put into a canvas bag and shipped through when you travel. This is when I was testing it out in the town of Newtown, Pennsylvania. The cloth that you see on the back is actually bright orange on the top and then black underneath. The theory being that if you have 2 thin layers of cloth, whatever light would go through one would be filtered by the other. And so eventually we decided to do an international trip, and France and I took a trip to Ireland. We went to Ireland in 1996. We had gone there many times before. In fact, we got engaged there. We had our honeymoon there. We even bought a house there. But in this particular case, we were doing an expedition. We did not know of anyone who was traveling with collodion aside from, driving a few hundred miles from their home. Nobody was traveling internationally. And it was an interesting trip. We packed everything in a very sturdy box. We shipped it to Ireland. I made the mistake of using those, what are they?
Allen wrench.
Well, it's a kind of screw that has a funny shape to the opening. And they weren't well known back then, but I had the tool, I used it, seemed like a great idea, but when it got to Irish Customs, they didn't have the tool. And so they had to chisel around all of the screws and use vice grips to unthread the screws to check our baggage. More bizarre was that the time that our plane was scheduled to fly was about the same time that a flight leaving New York City exploded in midair. And so we actually felt the turbulence, and our plane was the plane immediately after that, took off that morning. We didn't know what it was until later, and until we actually arrived in Ireland. But all the time, the news feed back home was talking about a plane that blew up at 8 something in the morning out of New York City. And of course, our family thought that we died on the plane. But more importantly, they thought that we actually caused the plane to crash because we were doing collodion. Collodion is flammable. As it turns out, we actually sent the collodion through a freight flight. So we were not responsible at all, of course. And it was a great tragedy. When we got to Ireland, how long were we there, France?
Month.
About a month. And we made over 120 negatives. We didn't have any that we couldn't use. We got into a real groove when we were shooting, France. And here we go. And so here's a picture that I took of a waterfall in the east of Ireland. And what's the name of that waterfall?
Powers Court.
It's what?
Powers Court.
Powers Court. Powers Court waterfall. And yeah, we came back with a lot of plates. Here's one just of a sky. And after that experience, we realized that we could travel with the stuff. It was expensive. Back then, to ship our collodion and varnish, it cost $800. And the reason for that is there has to be a 24-hour hotline. It has to be packed a certain way. Someone has to sniff it and follow the entire route. Traveling with collodion was not an easy thing back then, but it was worth it. We're still selling pictures from that body of work. And during that time, I was working for the George Eastman Museum just a couple of years later. And the museum would then send us to different places around the world to teach historic processes, collodion being the most common one, but other processes as well. And so here is a picture of the two of us just above Mexico City after doing a week of teaching several different processes. And so we would have the jobs to do where we would go to different countries and do the teaching. But then we'd have maybe 3 days to a week off afterwards. And since we had our cameras and we had the chemistry, all we had to do was make a darkroom. And so on the left of this picture, you can see France leaning against a portable darkroom using the same cloth that we used over and over again, but the darkroom itself is actually a cardboard box. And so when we arrive in a country, the first thing we do is get a van that has some kind of lift tailgate. And then we go to an appliance store and find a box that fits. And within, I think, did we clock it once, France? I think the fastest one we made was maybe in 15 minutes in Japan. All it took was duct tape and a box cutter and a piece of red glass that we used for the window. Here's an image that France made during that same trip. In fact, I think it's actually at the same location where the previous slide was taken. The ground there is a bright red earth, and that's why it comes out so dark. Here's another picture. This is me, much younger me, and this is in Spain. I have no clue when this was taken, maybe 1998. And I'm tying up the box. In this case, it's the wooden box. And I've erected the wood box. I've put the cloth around it. I'm just getting ready to put it in the back of the car. On the left is our camera, our trusty camera that so many people have learned collodion with. And in the background, I want you to notice the subject. This is a spot, an abandoned farmstead. And right behind it is actually the subject. You'll see that in this picture. This is the image that was taken of that spot. And it shows me thinking about the artifacts of the process that can actually contribute. Now, again, people love collodion because it can be really messy. And it's kind of neat. And there's a lot of talk about wabi-sabi, serendipity. In this particular case, I used it in the sky. Developer sweeps happen all the time, and you would never see those lines in the bottom of the picture because it's visually busy. But in an area like the sky, you're going to see it. And when I printed this image, I actually printed it deeper to feature those lines. And the reason for that is because they followed the same rhythm of where the dirt meets the building on the bottom, where the top of the building meets the mountaintop, and where the mountaintop meets the sky. And then there's one more layer, and that is the artifact of pouring the developer across the sky. So for me, that's the reason to have a process artifact, not because it's just kind of neat. It's something that should contribute to the picture. When there's too many of them, I can't get excited about it. Here's another image. In this particular case, it's another farmstead. In this case, it's actually a place where there are people who live there. And this is an enormous pile of shit outside of a barn. And above on the roof, you'll notice the birds. There are actually only about 6 birds on the roof. But because the exposure was upwards of 40 seconds, every time a bird moved and held still for a second, it would be photographed. And this kind of ghost imagery also was a great inspiration for my later work. I love the ghost imagery. And so when I came up to Rochester to work at the George Eastman Museum, I couldn't do the medicine show anymore. I had done it for 20 years. It was the sort of thing, it was entertainment, and people would hire me, but they're not going to hire somebody that says, oh, I can't make it next week. I have to take a trip to demonstrate something and I can't come to your festival. It just doesn't work. And so I retired the medicine show. But more people saw the medicine show in a body of work that I called confidence. And the confidence, of course, a confidence man, snake oil salesman. I love when people say the word snake oil salesman as if there's something wrong with it. Here is our studio in Rochester, and this is where I'm sitting right now. In fact, I'm off to the left-hand corner. Of course, it's dark right now, so it's skylight studios aren't quite as interesting at night. But we built this studio so that I could do research for the museum. At the time, I was teaching photo conservators in a program that lasted 10 years. My job was to do primary research, to understand how the evolution of photography worked, and to show people how the various processes were done so they can determine the difference between something that's a process artifact that happened at the time it was made or something that happened over time and by mishandling. Sometimes they're very subtle differences. And France at the time was also using the studio for her own work and for teaching. She would teach private tutorials. At that time, I got very interested in the kind of chiaroscuro lighting that you might see in a Dutch painting from the 1600s. And so this is an image of some of the bottles, and it's an ambrotype that has something that I call burnishing, where I rub the silver very slightly. And by rubbing the highlights, in an ambrotype, the light parts of the picture of silver and the dark parts are something dark, like, you know, a black material or a tintype. And then I added pigments, powdered pigments, to show the reflections off the skylight and the colors of liquids. The Confidence series was kind of driven by these experiments with doing ambrotypes like this. And so here is the gallery card. The Confidence show opened at the Howard Greenberg Gallery in New York City. And it featured pictures of me as Dr. Bumstead. And all of the images of me are either out of focus because of focal plane or moving. The concept being that the props, of course, can be handed down from one generation to the next. You can find it in an antique shop. But I'm flesh and bone, and I won't be around forever. And it was a good show. It was a successful show at Greenberg's. It got people to notice that the ambrotype or collodion can be something more than what you find as Civil War reenactment, or people just kind of dressed up to look old-fashioned. In this particular case, Howard Greenberg said to me, you know, I love the fact that your work is surreal. And I said, I'm not a surrealist. He said, well, look at your work. I said, here's the thing. Doing a medicine show for 20 years is what's surreal. All I'm doing is making images based on my memory of the show. And so here's another example that shows burnishing on the microphone and the metal parts, a little bit of flesh tinting, and then just me out of focus. All of these are self-portraits. I take the cap off the camera and I walk into the picture and I listen to a metronome to get the right amount of time. In this particular case, it's actually a continuous double exposure. I sit in the picture, then I walk out, then I wheel in this apparatus, and you have to have exactly the right amount of time for the solid, which is over my head, to reveal my face. And I did experiment with distressing these. Again, most people think of my work as very clean, but I have my moments. In this case, it's dropping cyanide and iodine on the plate, which instantly destroys silver. Based on the Confidence series, I did a body of work that was called Free Show Tonight. And what it was, essentially my memory, a Munchausen-like memory of me doing a traveling medicine show at night, which we did do. We use gas lights. And so this is me. Trying to make an image like this can take an entire day because there's nothing, when I'm at the camera, I'm not there to focus on. I can only get a sense of what's focused, but I can't really see how the light is going to be on my face. And so this particular one is the one called Step Right Up. This one and I like the economy of image here. You know that's me. All you need is that collar, the hat, and the side of my face to establish that that is Bumstead. And this is a head measuring machine. And for those of you who are familiar with George Eastman Museum, this was the archivist at the time, Joe Struble. This is an appeal to the audience. And again, nothing here is in focus. Why use ambrotype? Ambrotypes are backwards if they're on dark glass. Anyway, these are all on dark glass. And when you look in the background, you see lettering, but you can't read it. It's a perfect medium for this. It's like when you wake up in the morning and you're trying to tell your spouse the dream you had, and you can only find bits and pieces. France asked if I would do a series to show how I make one of these. And so she came up and took some slides. It's hard because I'm moving during the thing, but here's a series of slides showing me making one of these. I walk into the scene, I move around. I came up with an idea of showing smoke by moving aluminum foil, and here's the ambrotype. And so in that ambrotype, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different movements. I believe this one is in the collection of the Nelson Atkins Gallery in Kansas City. I think it is, yeah. At the same time, I made negatives. Now, glass plate negatives with the collodion process require twice the exposure. So they're a different creature. And of course, they're not backwards. And so here's the same scene, but different. This is a salted paper print of the same idea. The title of this is Blowing Smoke. Here's another one from the same series. Again, a salted paper print from a wet collodion negative of me, 3 positions. This one, I'm actually lighting a gas light to release paper wasps from a paper wasp nest. The negative gives you one more layer to play with. And so a little later series showing me retouching a negative. And here's the negative. And what I'm doing is I'm augmenting the smoke I made with tinfoil with actual retouching on tissue paper on the back of the glass negative. And there's the image. This particular image is called the Rhodes Incident. Look up Rhodes Opera House in Boyertown, Pennsylvania. The opera house was filled with people from the town. Those who weren't on stage were in the audience, and the man running the magic lantern for a previous part of the evening's performance allowed the tube to release from the generator, the gas generator, which you can see on the right-hand side. That's the gas generator. It caught a fire on the stage, and half of the town died in the fire. They couldn't get out of the building because the doors opened the wrong direction. It's a very tragic and interesting story. It's the Rhodes Opera House in Boyertown, Pennsylvania. A few years ago, I did a body of work called Tsukumogami. Actually, it was called Still Life because France had pictures of her sleep images, and I had these. But the concept was based on Tsukumogami, and this is a concept that the Japanese have, a folktale, that inanimate objects, often in the home, will come to life after 100 years and torment their owners. Now, the Japanese know about this. I'm not sure it would fly over here, but this picture in particular, I had a tragic accident in our studio. One of my rare collodion bottles fell and broke. And actually there were 2 that broke. And I just couldn't bear to throw it out. I had to take a picture of it. And so here are 3 bottles, including the broken one in the center. Now, in Japan, the number 3 is good luck. The number 4 is bad luck. It is death. It turns out that the word for 4 sounds very much like death. And so when you look at this picture, the first thing you see are 3 subjects, but then the last one is in the back, and you recognize that this is actually about 4 and not 3. In these pictures, often the pieces are removed during the exposure to make them even more translucent. So they're ghost images of objects. Here's another. This one is, essentially the stolen book or the missing book. And you'll see that there are ghost images in this. There's a camera obscura on the second shelf there that's ghostly. There's also a guillotine shutter just below that. This is my favorite bookcase that's in our living room. And I had to bring it up 2 stories up to the studio to take this picture. This one harkens back actually to an image I made years before, but I like this version better. This is the spilled tea. And it does give you an idea of how that burnishing looks on the teapot and the cup, and subtle tinting, and also appreciating the light. I appreciate how things are lighted. Photography is writing with light. The shadows are just as important. And so these to me have the feeling of small paintings, the painter I should have been. Another one that has some smoke and also ghost images. Several of them were photographed in this niche. And also in this body of work, I did a few things that had to do with automobiles. In the left picture, that is the radiator from when I flipped over my car and ended up with the car on top of me. That accident, I had no broken bones, no internal injuries, but I had deep bruising the week afterwards. That week afterwards, France and I were giving a workshop at Niepce's home in Saint-Lô-de-Varennes in France. On the right-hand side, this is a carburetor, and this is smoke, again, smoke coming out of the carburetor. This is the Oracle of Delphi. I call this the Oracle, having to do with Greek mythology. But these 2 images got me to thinking that there's more I can do with car parts. So now I'm going back. I showed you the inspiration for anatomy, and now here is the body of work. I found this book, Dyke's Anatomy of the Automobile. And it said to me, I have to do something about the anatomy of the automobile. And also things like the Ford price list of body parts. Of course, I'm going to use body parts. And I think I'm not going to make it so clean this time. You know, the advantage of being very good at a process, of controlling a process, is that you can take the time to be less careful for certain effects. If all you can do is be not careful, you don't have a choice. Then serendipity is making your art. For me, I like the process artifacts sometimes, but I like them on my terms. This is a negative that I made in Florence in Italy, and I didn't varnish it. And over time, it turned into this. So there are scratches and discoloring, and but it's a negative object. Here is a albumin on glass plate, one of the first hyalotypes I made, and it's got all kinds of storms going on. And so I said, okay, Mark, this body of work is different. Lighten up a little bit. Just be easy and maybe encourage some artifacts. And it turns out that even the subjects themselves have artifacts. And so here is my garage. And immediately in front of my garage is where I have dripped oil for the last 20 years because Model Ts have a habit of marking their territory like this. And so the very first image I made was the operating floor. The drips of oil, I even used the car to hold the tripod to take the picture of the drips of oil. And here is the first image of the series. And in this particular case, you can see on the bottom edges, you can see where the developer didn't quite cover. You can see some sweeps. The focus is very shallow. When you see the actual prints, and these are like 16 by 20 prints, you can pick out nuts and bolts in the focused areas of the image. Now, mind you, I know these are not pretty pictures. It's not the sort of thing that everybody gravitates to. You find that with collodion, most people are interested in portraits. Yeah, I wasn't so interested. My own portrait as Bumstead, but I'm interested in this sort of thing. And of course, looking at the body, right? The body. This is actually called the bun. And so this this picture of the bun on the left leads me to after I got that part of the car consolidated. And I made those marks like I saw on the hyalotype. I made them on purpose. I did them sometimes and I didn't do them other times. In this particular case, for those of you who are collodion shooters, I dipped the plate into the silver bath and immediately brought it out, let it stand for about 5 seconds and put it back into the silver again. And so the silver nitrate running off the plate in what they used to call rivulets produced these streaks, these images. On the right-hand side, I didn't think it was appropriate. Again, you have to have a reason for why you think these artifacts work. And in some case they do, in some case they don't, at least for me. Here's an establishing shot of the inside of a fender. This is the one that was behind the garage and the image. All of these were taken in the Skylight studio with natural light. A picture from the catalog and the carburetor. And these are the setups. If you look on the left-hand side, that is actually the entire engine pan. And in its little window, kind of a niche window in the bottom of the pan, which is upright, you see some of the seat material. And what I'm looking for really is the juxtaposition of the different textures, you know, as if you open something up and you find this. On the right-hand side, the carburetor laid inside the very same pan, not because it fits in the pan or belongs in the pan, but, you know, I was thinking at the time of green peppers, right, in a pan. And so here is the one that shows the engine pan with the cloth. And again, it's opening something up and discovering a completely different texture. And the one of the carburetor. I did several of this carburetor and other carburetors, again, because it looks so much like a heart. And you don't know what that thing is behind, but that thing behind is perfect. It catches the light on the left side of the picture to juxtapose against the dark side of the object. And it has its own shadow on the right side of the picture to juxtapose where the light is hitting the object. It is a perfect place to place that. Now, the negatives that I was making, well, they look something like this. I did them all in 4x5. I was given the opportunity to make this body of work so that I could have a show in Israel. And I had very limited time to shoot it. I believe I started in October and I had 150 plates by like December, something like that. I was under the wire. And also I was working, so I could only do these on weekends. Another one of the heart. If you notice the edges, there's some very interesting ragged edges on these. I was actually taking the plates out of the silver bath and running my fingernail along the edges, putting them on damp paper towels that had cyanide on them so that I could get a certain kind of a streak. The lower corner of this has some cyanide streaking on that plate. But I'm still interested in the physicality of the subject, the roundness, the three-dimensionality of this image. And if I put too much on the plate that's a process artifact, I won't have that feeling of depth anymore. It would take me right to the surface. When I'm up in the studio, I could just hold the plates up to the skylight window. And in this particular case, I'm taking a picture of the negative. And thank goodness we have iPhones, because now I can push a button and I can invert the picture and get a sense of what it would look like as a positive print. I did this quite a bit while I was making these images. Here's a comparison shot. On the right-hand side is the actual setup, and on the left is the photograph. I will often bring in things into the background, and it doesn't make any difference what the thing is. It only makes a difference what the thing does. And so that on the right-hand side, you'll see what looks to be like a box that has a curved interior that's green. That's the lid off of an antique phonograph. And if you look at what it does in the picture in the background, all it says is that there's something out of the focal plane. And once you introduce something that's 5 feet, something that's 10 feet, something that's 20 feet, you have a feeling of depth behind the subject that places it so that it has that three-dimensional look. On the left-hand side, that is the trunk, what they lovingly call the turtle deck on a Model T. And the key, I knew I wanted to do something with it. And so I started sketching some ideas. And so I have, these are pictures of where the battery box is in the car. And I like the sensation that you're not quite sure what's under there. So here are 2 pictures of the battery box cover. I like the one on the left better because you don't really see what's under there. One of the favorites of my entire series of anatomy is of the gas tank. When I bought the car, the gas tank looked like this. Mice had taken padding from the seat and made a nest on the top, which would absorb water, and eventually rusted out the tank and the side of the car. When I removed the gas tank, I left it behind the garage for months because I knew I had to take pictures of it. And here's the image from that. And again, it's this collodion quality of having a crystalline detail, but also when you photograph with collodion, the parts that are out of focus have a feeling of substance, at least if you have some light back there. If it's all black, you don't have that. This has a gradient of light because the inside of the gas tank is round, and it's all about how you light it. One of the pulleys for pulling the engine, and in the garage pulling the engine. There were other things that I thought about. Here is, testing a carburetor, and on the right-hand side, boiling a carburetor to clean it. Another view of that same type of carburetor for a Model T, and the image I made with that. I experimented with some of the fog or smoke that I had done with earlier images. I didn't do too much of it. I did for some things. The texture of the cloth on the seats. In fact, I wore these seats out. I drove the car so much once it was going that the seats fell apart. But I took these pictures before I changed them. And I took them with the collodion. So here is that texture of crackled. Now at 65, I look at the skin on my hand, and I think I see exactly the same pattern. I know, France, you don't have it. I have. And on the left-hand side, a juncture of where a fender, a splash apron, and a hood meet. And on the right-hand side, the collodion image with this dark triangle. What's down that hole, right? And this also has that pattern that I did from pulling the plate out too soon when I'm sensitizing. I also did this very same image without that. I'm not quite sure which one I like best. I don't like everything I do. When you work on a car like this and you're dyslexic, this is how you figure out wiring systems. I do diagrams of everything. And so this is the wiring of the Model T, showing which direction various wires have to go. And so when I took the car apart, I tried to remove all of the wires intact. It reminded me of when they do dissections and dissect the nervous system. And so on the right-hand side, with pins on a board, this is the nervous system for the car. And the wiring itself has its own beauty. Toward the end, actually, I believe it was the last day of varnishing plates, I had a mishap. I was carrying a rack of 25 plates from one room to another down in our dark room, and I hit the doorway by accident, and I dropped the entire rack of negatives. I was in tears. I was on my knees picking up the pieces and wondering which ones would survive. It turned out that only 6 plates broke. It was a miracle. And so I gathered up the pieces, I put them on a light table, and I started to wonder which ones could I still use. You know, I'm going to turn this into lemonade, right? And so it turned out that this one worked for me. It's a frayed wire. It's when you think of frayed wires, you think of electrical problems, you think of sparks. The break worked for me. And so we left it in the show like this, the print. Sometimes I set something up and I don't quite like the way it looks. If you look on the right-hand side is a reference shot. On the left side of the, or pardon me, on the right-hand side is the establishing shot. On the left side of that, you'll see that there's a glue bottle that doesn't appear in the final image. I didn't think the glue bottle worked at all. And yet, something you'll see a lot of my work over the years, whenever I do a still life, I often put things coming in from the sides, even if it's just a sliver, because I want people to think that I came upon these scenes, even though they're very, very thought out. I'm way too German to just come upon these things and just accept it. I have to control it. And so on the left-hand side of the actual image, that is actually a brush rack that I got in Japan on a trip. I thought that the texture there worked much better than repeating the glass texture of the jar. These are the wheels. The wheels to me had the same sense of bones, brittle bones. I still go through that with my damn car. The wheels are from 1923. They're made out of hickory, and whenever you hear them click when you turn a corner, you know you have a spoke that's bad. These particular wheels, a lot of the paint had come off, and so you could really see the texture of the wood, and you get that feeling of them being brittle. I had several of these rear axle housings that someone had cut and used as a way to raise up your car off the ground. And so I put them in the garage in kind of a repeating pattern, and I used aluminum foil to create the smoke. I was thinking at this point that it was kind of like the factory, the source. Where is the source of this machine? And so in this particular image, you see the smoke coming out of these things. And then there was a secondary image that was based on what is that smoke? It turns out that that's not really smoke. It's just stuff that's spewing out of the tops of these things. So I hooked up nuts and bolts with wire, and I put it on a spring bar. And during the exposure, I moved it up and down to get this. So essentially, this is a detail of that stuff that's coming out of those things in the garage. One of the few pictures of me actually working on the body of work. And I'm taking a picture of the transmission with the cover askew, letting steam out. Out of all the images, I think I like the tires the best. The tires were interesting. I could, these are not the tires, excuse me, the inner tubes. I could blow them up, and during the exposure, they would move slightly as they released air. If you've ever taken pictures of live flowers, sometimes that happens where they move over time when you do a long exposure. But they were so sensual, the material of the tires. I think I could have done a body of work of just the tubes and the tires. And so here is also one of the original tires. I had to cut the tires off of the rims with a saw. I felt really bad about it. And what was interesting is that the inner tubes that were in some of these tires were bright red. And it was alarming when I cut into them and this red stuff came out. I'm going to end my talk on anatomy with this last image. which is again one of the tires that I cut. When I cut this tire, it was actually fairly smooth. And over a period of about a week, things started to unravel. They would pop and they would fleck and they would move. And so I put them kind of almost together to create this feeling of tension of maybe quite touching or maybe being pulled apart. And so I could talk a lot about anatomy, but I think you probably had enough. I just want to make it known that Dror Mahan is the one who said, Mark, I want you to do a body of work and you can do anything you want and we'll have a show. And so we premiered the anatomy series in Israel. We were to have a show in Tokyo this month, but of course the pandemic panned it. So made it impossible. And I want to thank Bryce for his help and Holden as well. So I can tender any questions if there are any. And France will bring my face back on the screen.
Wow.
I know you're saying that just to be nice, but
No, I'm not. I'm actually, I made a little call to the audience to ask questions, and my good friend Dale Zog wrote back, we're all too mesmerized by this talk to even, form questions. That being said,
the medicine show, it's all a medicine show,
Yeah. That being said, we do have a handful of good questions. We'll pick a few of these, and I'll kind of merge some of them. One of the earliest questions we got was, you use so many different processes. When you're starting a project, how do you decide, which of the processes, historic processes that you know? How do you know which is the right one? How do you go through that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's a wonderful way to start this. I started with daguerreotype in college, and then I went to collodion when I started teaching at a private high school. And then over the years, I had something called the 39 Steps, my favorite Hitchcock movie, which was to fulfill understanding processes before collodion and after collodion that would teach me the evolution of photography. I got to the point where I could understand intimately a lot of these most of the processes, and I can teach them, and I can help people make really good ones, like albumin printing. I can help you make a perfect albumin print, but I never found it attractive for any of my work. I do carbon printing. I think if I were to choose a process for printing, I would drift into carbon printing if I had all the time in the world. I love salted paper prints for most of my printing. And I still like ambrotypes, but for different reasons. And I think that one of the problems people have, they get so excited about a process because it's so liberating to be able to make something on your own, but then they spend a long time trying to find the right fit. Essentially what I did. Yeah. Some people force a process because they love the process. And yet it probably doesn't really work for whatever body of work that is. In my own shows, I hate to talk about process. If someone comes up to talk to me about process at an opening, I consider it an insult. It's like talking to a painter about their brushes when you go to an opening of paintings. Now, mind you, my job is teaching process, but I'm allowed to have more than one hat. So yes, I mean, picking the right process should be all based on how it contributes, or how you feel it contributes to the image. If you do a body of work and all you do is talk about process and not about the actual work, you haven't arrived yet. It's just how I feel about it.
Yeah.
It took me a long time to arrive with how things would work with collodion.
Cool. Well, then this next question, then in fact, may be insulting, but I'm going to merge a few people who do have some tweaky.
What brushes do I use?
Yeah, right. One is, you're making prints from plates. What process are you using to make those prints? Some ask questions about the tinting, the selective tinting you're doing, and just general questions about the length of these exposures you're doing, for straight ones, for the multiple exposures. So those are some of the more broad technical.
No, I understand, and this is a photography conference. It makes sense to ask those questions. I'm just saying, as an artist, when I'm in a gallery, I don't like to answer those kinds of questions. But my job is actually to answer people's questions about this. The prints that I made for this body of work are digital. I knew that I wanted to use a small camera so that I could get in close. I also knew that a collodion plate has such high resolution that when you blow it up, you don't really lose anything. So I'm one of the people that really likes the idea of combining new and old technologies. Always have. Years ago when we did the landscape images, and mind you, every time we took a trip, we made landscape images. We always use silver gelatin prints and often split tone those. On the other hand, I do a lot of salt prints. France too. France likes salt printing for a lot of her work. And so the choice again for printing has to do with what looks best. And for the anatomy series, I think the prints are great as a digital print. Now, you asked about tinting.
Yeah, some people have asked about some of the selective tinting.
Yeah. Selective tinting, of course, it was done in the 19th century, and you'll see daguerreotypes that will occasionally have a little girl's green dress. They often did cheeks. Still lifes weren't really done very much with hard images. In fact, it's quite rare. But I love the still life. And so my tinting of still lifes was actually quite different than 19th century work. And essentially what that is grinding up pastel pigment and using a sable brush and pouncing the color only where the silver is, which are the light areas. You can't tint an ambrotype or tintype on the dark areas because there's nothing there for the color to stick to. And the concept of burnishing is really my invention. The British had something where they would take an ambrotype and rub it with a piece of wool to just make the whole thing shiny. And I took that one step further with different sized brushes and rubbing very carefully with my little fingertip or the brushes to take essentially the silver. The silver are little particles, and if you lay the particles down, they become reflective. Since they are real silver, what you get is something that's shiny and metallic and silver. If you rub just a little bit, it just changes the color from that kind of coffee with cream tan to a gray. So it just gives me one more level as far as that feeling of depth in the image.
Boy, it sure does work. I mean, you're almost perplexed because it's so subtle, but it almost just pulls you into the image because something's going on. It's super subtle, and you go, oh. So
I'm glad you're perplexed.
Yeah.
And the biggest compliment I've had is when people look at the images and they say, "Are they photographs?" That's okay. If they think it's a painting of some sort, I'm okay with that.
Well, Mark, I know that we have audience members from all over. There's a message here from someone saying greetings from Ireland. But the last question I'm going to ask, and I have no idea where he's writing from, but I'm going to butcher his name, Alev Burbroglu, and I'm sorry for that, Alev.
Yeah, I think you butchered that name.
Yeah, I know I did. But I thought interesting. He's I don't know where he is, but he's getting a PhD in art history, and he's been studying historic processes and coming across images. And what he's having difficulty doing is determining what process was used. And he wanted to know if you had any good reference sources or ways he might figure out what he's looking at.
Well, of course, that's really the thing I was doing at the museum for 10 years. I was teaching conservators how to identify different types of process and variants of process, and often by the problems that they have when they age. There are a few books, but there's no one great book, and it's very hard. The best thing I can say is to set aside some money and buy images to put together your own study collection. And what you need is a good example, a great example, an example that's not so great, and one that's perfectly dead. And that way you'll start to understand how to look at these things. And all the people that I taught over the 10 years at the Advanced Residency Program of Photograph Conservation, hooray, they all had study collections, and they traded things back and forth. The other thing you can do is have your school hire me to come over, and I'll bring a box of them and show you how to identify them. And that's something we've done for years.
I'm going to throw it back to Holden in 1 second, but I just want to thank you, Mark and France. I've loved that. And I want to remind everybody that Mark is going to be back again on Saturday. We've collected a handful of folks who work in historic processes in different ways and who champion it and teach it. And so we're going to have a lively panel discussion on Saturday. So please join us again. Holden, do you want to say any last words before we thank everybody and send them off?
I just wanted to congratulate Mark on his wonderful leap of imagination. The Anatomy series is a tour de force of seeing. And I think that is what photography is at its core, is imagination, imaginative seeing. And I see a lot of quoting of Weston and Strand, but carried forward into a realm where they would never go. And so I wanted to congratulate Mark on a beautiful body of work.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Agreed. And again, everybody, if you have friends who missed this, we have recorded it.
She does the technical work.
Yeah,
at least the modern
we totally get that. But we have recorded this, and probably not until after the festival is done and we have a chance to breathe. But we are going to post this up on a YouTube channel or a Vimeo channel or both. So if you want to invite friends who missed this to view it at a later date, it will be available. So
Great.
Thank you guys for attending. Mark, France, Holden, thank you guys so much. Welcome to Click, and we'll see you guys again maybe tomorrow.
All right. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.